Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, so if you've ever talked vintage gear, you know the big names, right? Maestro, Sola Sound. Maybe Vox comes up. But what if we told you that maybe the real giant, the foundational company behind some of the wildest, most iconic sounds of the late 60s, 70s, is a name you probably don't recognize? Today, our mission is to dive deep into the source material on Shin Companion. They were this Japanese pioneer operating kind of in the shadows, but shaping global rock music, almost totally anonymous. We're going to pull back the curtain, try and find the genius behind the circuits that define Hendrix, and believe it or not, whole genres decades later.
Yeah, and that anonymity, it wasn't really an accident. It was basically their business model. Shinai's whole identity was being the master builders, the silent partners, you could say. They were the OEM original equipment manufacturer. They designed and built these amazing circuits. And then they sold them to other brands. Think Univox, Ibanez. Those guys just slapped their logos on Shinai's work. They were the hidden engineering brains.
That's it right there, the key insight. We're talking about the architect, not the decorator, yeah. And when you look at what lasted, two designs stand out as just legendary. You've got that hallucinatory throbbing sound of the Univibe, and then at the other extreme, one of the most abrasive fuzz pedals ever made, the Super Fuzz. All right, let's unpack this. Let's start with how they operated their strategy.
Right, so Shin Companion pops up in Japan mid-1960s, and this is exactly when demand for effects is just exploding globally. Fuzz, wow, that's the sound of rock in the US, the UK. But often, supply couldn't keep up, and the pedals were expensive. What's fascinating here is how Shin just jumped on that demand.
Yeah, instead of pouring money into building their own brand like Maestro did, they focused purely on the engineering, the manufacturing, and high-volume export. They built for, seemingly everyone. Univox, Ibanez, Apollo, Jax, the list goes on. They basically became the go-to source if you wanted to get a pedal on the shelf fast and cheap.
Exactly. And that OEM strategy, it let them scale up incredibly quickly. They became one of the biggest global suppliers of guitar effects in the late 60s into the 70s.
Yeah.
Because they weren't paying for all that branding and marketing everywhere. They could often undercut the competition. So their designs just flooded the world market under all these different names.
Yeah.
Effects became way more accessible to everyday players. It was market dominance through sheer engineering availability.
Right. So you might have bought some cheap Univox pedal back then, thinking it was just, a budget option. But you were probably playing a genuine Shin circuit without even knowing it, which raises a great question about, who gets the credit? Because out of this flood of stuff, one product totally broke the mold, became this accidental icon, the Univibe.
The Univibe. Yeah, released 68. It's a perfect example of tech genius doing something totally unexpected. The engineer credited is Fumio Maeda, a brilliant designer.
And the intended idea was pretty simple. A rotary speaker simulator trying to get that big swirling Leslie speaker sound into a little box. But here's the thing. It kind of failed at being a Leslie sim and spectacularly succeeded at being something completely new and different.
Exactly. And the reason why it sounds so unique is down to the tech. Yeah. This is where the deep dive gets interesting. See, a normal tremolo just turns volume up and down, right? And a phaser uses electronics to shift the phase. The Univibe didn't do either of those things. What's fascinating is the mechanism. You use this little light bulb inside, rotating and shining on 4 photoresistors, LDRs. That light-based system created this pulsing, shifting signal, totally neat. Had this 3-dimensional, chewy feel. It wasn't chorus, wasn't tremolo. It was a weird, wonderful light modulation.
And that sound... Here's where it gets really interesting. That liquid swirling thing was exactly what late 60s psychedelia was craving. Its legendary status, cemented almost immediately, mainly by Jimi Hendrix. You just have to listen to him at Woodstock. Or that incredible, warbling sound on Machine Gun.
Oh, yeah.
That's 100% Univibe.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just Hendrix. Think Robin Trower. His whole early 70s sound, especially on tracks like Bridge of Sighs. That's just drenched in Univibe.
Yeah.
That throbbing wash is the sound. And it's still one of the most cloned, most revered modulation pedals ever, because that light bulb thing just creates a sound that's really hard to nail digitally. It has that physical movement.
Okay, so let's shift gears completely now from that smooth, swirling modulation to the absolute opposite end of the spectrum, pure sonic aggression. Fuzz, Shin was incredibly prolific here too. Just pumping out fuzz designs, rebranding them constantly for export. They had a few, like the Companion Fuzz FY2, that's kind of a cult classic now, raw, buzzy, 2-transistor thing.
Yeah.
But the real powerhouse, their other big design from around 68, was the Companion Fuzz FY6.
The FY6, right. That's the circuit that became the famous Univox Super Fuzz over in the States.
Yeah.
And If the Univibe was smooth and liquid, the Super Fuzz was like razor blades.
In a good way.
It's consistently cited as one of the most aggressive, intense fuzz pedals ever made, period.
But why? What makes it sound so different from, say, a fuzz face or a tone bender? What's going on inside?
Okay, if we connect this to the bigger picture, fuzz design.
Yeah.
The Super Fuzz is famous for two main things. First, it has this really scooped mid-range. So the distortion is massive, huge, but it kind of sits back in the mix. Great for big chords. But second, and this is key, it generates this weird kind of glitchy octave up harmonic, especially on higher notes. It gives it this searing, almost synth-like quality, really cuts through that unique character. That's why people like Pete Townsend of The Who loved it, but it's also why it became this secret weapon like decades later for entire genres.
Totally. You listen to early Mudhoney, or, countless stoner rock, doom metal bands today. They are chasing that specific sound, that aggressive, buzzy, octavey thing. That aggression became its calling card. And again, the circuit exported everywhere. Apollo, Jax, Kent. And it was fundamental in those early Ibanez pedals, too.
Right. And by the early 70s, Shin wasn't resting. They were pushing complexity. We see them making some of the first multi-effects units. These massive pedals with fuzz, wah, and volume in one treadle. Pretty wild stuff back then. They were also jumping into the octave fuzz market directly, competing with things like the Octavia, with their own octave box. Clearly, they were the design leaders in Japan at that point.
Okay, but let's pause here. Let's bring in a critical question. If Shin was so dominant, so innovative, was sticking only to that OEM model maybe a mistake? Did being anonymous eventually lead to their downfall?
That's a really important question. I think there's something to that. They totally relied on their manufacturing skill, their designs, but they never built that direct consumer loyalty. No one knew the Shin name. So by the late 1970s, what happens? Fierce competition arrives. You get these new Japanese giants, Boss, which was part of Roland, and Maxon, who are making pedals for Ibanez. And these companies, they learned from Shin about quality Japanese manufacturing, but they coupled it with strong, consistent branding, and critically, the compact pedal format.
Right. Suddenly, having a small, reliable, cool-looking Boss pedal, it was just easier, maybe seen as more professional, than wrestling with some big, sometimes confusingly labeled Shin multi-effect or older fuzz. The OEM giant kind of got overshadowed by the brand builders, companies that, ironically, used Shin success as their own blueprint. And the Shin brand itself eventually faded from the market.
It did. But, and this is the really cool part, the payoff. Even though the brand declined, those original circuits, the Univibe and the Super Fuzz, they didn't fade at all. They achieved this legendary afterlife status. Vintage ones, hugely collectible, super expensive now. And the whole boutique pedal boom in the 90s and 2000s was practically built on cloning and celebrating those two specific Shin designs. They just kept coming back.
So what does this all mean then? Why should you care about this silent architect if their name isn't even on the pedal you might own?
I think we can boil it down to four huge takeaways from this deep dive. First, global supplier. Their OEM focus made cutting-edge sounds accessible worldwide under dozens of different names. Mass market impact.
Second, the Univibe invention. Just a singular, iconic modulation sound. That light bass pulse defined Hendrix, Trower, and so many others. Still does.
Third, the Super Fuzz. It's still relevant, cited constantly as one of the most aggressive fuzzes ever, anchoring whole genres of heavy music today, decades later.
And fourth, they perfected that Japanese OEM model. They proved that engineering and manufacturing expertise could be a massive global export business, even without the brand name. They kind of paved the way for the next wave, like Ibanez Maxon, who eventually took over the market they helped build.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, Shin is just this perfect case study, isn't it? How engineering genius, even when it's totally in the background hidden, can actually have a deeper, longer-lasting impact on culture, on the actual sound of music, than all the flashy marketing in the world.
Yeah.
They wrote the code, basically, that everyone else put in their shiny boxes.
Exactly. We've seen their genius was in building amazing things for others, often staying hidden to saturate the market. And that raises a really interesting question, I think, for you, the listener. How often are the real pioneers, in tech and design, whatever, purposefully staying behind the scenes, hidden behind the famous brands we see every day? Maybe they're the ones making things work, making them affordable, making them real. Definitely something to mull over next time you hear that unmistakable throb of a Univibe or the crushing sound of a Super Fuzz. Who really made that sound possible?